Talking treason, I hope.
If you've heard of the KLF, you probably know them as the band that burnt £1 million. But that is only the conclusion to their story. The journey that led them to the Isle of Jura on that fateful August morning is even more fascinating. A journey that includes getting sued by ABBA, gaining a #1 single in the guise of a talking car, pioneering at least one genre of dance music, and becoming one of the most successful singles bands of the early 90s. They were two men compelled by the forces of chaos to spread as much confusion as possible, and they transformed that into a pop career. This is New British Canon, and this is the story of the KLF. On New Year's Day 1987, at the age of 33, Bill Drummond decided he wanted to start making hip-hop. He had quit his job as an A&R for Warner Music 5 months prior, disillusioned with the corporate music machine. Previous to that, he'd been the manager of Echo and the Bunnymen and Teardrop Explodes. But in the same way that The Clash and punk had caught his attention in the late 70s, the back-to-basic sounds of hip-hop, in particular Beastie Boys and Schoolie D, had made him want to start anew.
I'm not surprised you're on my D. PS King, we're making that green. People always say, what the hell does that mean?
However, he didn't want to go it alone, so he drafted in the guitarist of Brilliant, Jimmy Cauty, who he knew had just acquired a sampler. Although I can play the guitar, and I can knock out a few things on the piano, I knew nothing personally about the technology. And I thought, I knew Jimmy. I knew he was a like spirit. We share similar tastes and backgrounds in music and things. So I phoned him up that day and said, let's form a band called the Justified Ancients of Moo Moo. The name had been taken from a sect in the Illuminatus trilogy, a cult sci-fi book series from the 70s. These Justified Ancients of Moo Moo infiltrated and subverted a secret world order, the Illuminati, spreading as much chaos and misinformation as they could. And with this band, Cauty and Drummond would do the same to the music industry. Cauty's former group, Brilliant, had been one of the last under Drummond's stewardship at Warner Music. Hyped for big things, for their major label debut, they had been teamed with Stock Aitken Waterman, who just had a worldwide smash with Dead or Alive, You Spin Me Round Like a Record.
You spin me right round, baby, right round, like a record, baby, right round.
And were now feeling themselves as a British Motown for the 80s. The label spent £300,000 on the album, Kiss the Lips of Life.
This is love, and love is war. Love is war.
And it limped to number 83 in the UK charts. But the revolutionary process of creating the record, with Cauty barely playing on the thing, had lit a fire underneath him. Me and bassist Youth sat there for a year watching them make these records, figuring out how they did the mixes and stuff. It was brilliant. We learned a hell of a lot. They were sampling like crazy, everything. Drum sounds, bass sounds, and nobody really knew they were doing that. They kept quiet about it all. The Jams would take this method and take it further, whereas Stock Aitken Waterman sampled obscure beats and hooks as a complement to their high street pop confections. Drummond and Cauty were going to sample whatever they wanted, with little thought for legality. In their minds, they were just recycling pop music, as well as taking from Sam Fox's Touch Me, I Want Your Body,
Touch me, I wanna feel your body. Touch me, touch me, touch me.
and AIDS PSAs.
Deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person.
Sexual intercourse. Sexual intercourse. No known cure.
First single, All You Need Is Love, stole from the paragons of pop themselves, the Beatles. As no label would release the track due to fear of prosecution, the Jams self-released a 500 run, a one-sided white label 12 inches, which they sent to DJs and the music press. But with their identities presented as King Boy D for Drummond and Rockman Rock for Cauty, they were expected to remain low-key and unknown. despite the arrogance of the sampling, with Drummond's heavily Scottish accented raps and Corty's sporadic beat interjections. It wasn't what could be called good.
We're back again, they never kicked us out. 20,000 years of shout, with a beatbox rhythm and a shipyard rhyme, with a hunt MCs on the River Clyde.
Oh yeah, they're very crude. Yeah, all we had was like a really cheap sampler, like a Greengate sampler, and we just went in and banged it down. It was not very sophisticated at all.
As fast as possible. Not nothing, we were just sort of rolling around in the studio, laughing, throwing things in. That'll do, this'll do, that'll do, like that, as fast as we could do it.
However, in March 1987, All You Need Is Love would earn a Single of the Week accolade in Sounds magazine, and all 500 copies would quickly sell out. 3 months later, they had the album out. 1987, What the Fuck Is Going On? On The Queen and I, the group cheekily poached the first 45 seconds of ABBA's Dancing Queen, with the Jam's only contributions being drum machine augments, scratches, and some off-key humming. It doesn't bother us, their records are still there. It's not as if we're taking anything away, just borrowing and making things bigger. If you're creative, you're not going to stop working just because there's the law against what you're doing. The mounting attention around the band made it so that the Jams soon had 3 separate major label injunctions against them, demanding the remaining copies of the album be destroyed. After consulting a lawyer who said taking it to court would cost them 20 grand, and they would lose. In December, the duo travelled by ferry to Stockholm in Sweden, in an attempt to reason with the members of ABBA themselves, flinging copies of their now unsellable album overboard as they went. Arriving at 3 in the morning and unable to find Agneta, Benny, Bjorn or Annifrid, they gave a gold disc certified for 0 copies sold to a sex worker who had a passing resemblance to Agneta, and burnt the remaining copies of the album in a field. By the end of 1987, Corty and Drummond had soured on hip-hop and the justified ancients of Moo Moo. We were a band that existed in the news pages of the music press, and I wanted to get away from that. Both Jimmy and I have an eternal thing of, as soon as something becomes a stable thing, of wanting to destroy it. Throughout 1987, another predominantly black genre of music made itself known in the UK. It was house music, and it and its squelchier Roland TB 303 powered sibling, Acid House, would take Britain's youth by storm.
Keep this frequency clear.
And Drummond and Corty were in awe of this potential next step. We were drawn to the purity of that kind of music that has no form, nothing to write about, no reference points and no irony. I was riddled with irony. It's something I continually want to cleanse myself of. But Drummond and Corty's first experiment in house didn't go as planned. They had wanted the hook of their dance track to be the Doctor Who theme, not only an iconic part of British culture, but a pivotal piece of electronic music's history. Problem was that the Doctor Who theme is in triplet time, and one of the essential elements of house is its 4-to-the-floor beat. Therefore, the only thing in their entire record collections that would fit was the double drum kit clomp of the Glitter Band from Rock and Roll Part 2. It took them 3 days to finish the track, adding the moronically simple chorus chant. Elements of Sweet's Blockbuster. And an impression of a Dalek delivering a Harry Enfield punchline. Not until a couple of days into it did we realise how terrible it was. It was like an out of control lorry, you know. You're just trying to steer it. And that track took itself over, really, and did what it wanted to do. We were just watching. They knew it was a hit, but they didn't want to ruin their reputation by having their name on it. Instead, Doctor in the TARDIS was released under the guise of the Time Lords, and fronted by Corty's car, a 1968 Ford Galaxy American police cruiser, now named Ford Time Lord.
What made you think that this song was going to be such a mega hit?
Well, firstly, good morning to you. It's great to be here at Biggin Hill. The song was all my idea.
The press rejected this nonsensical piece of promotional world building outright. However, because the British public fucking loved the Doctor Who theme, and that beat is undeniable, in June 1988, Doctor in the TARDIS went to number 1, which, released on their own label, KLF Communications, was quite the feat, as the BBC were not going to allow Ford Time Lord to perform on stage for Top the Pops. Corty and Drummond paraded around the stage doing their best glam rock stomp, beside some purposely shitty looking Daleks. With the Time Lords having served its purpose, the duo would move on to the next thing. But not before releasing a book on how to repeat their success called The Manual, How to Have a Number 1 the Easy Way. Part step-by-step guide, part satire, the literature impacts on the reader the golden rules of pop perfection. Firstly, it has to have a dance groove that will run all the way through the record, and that the current 7-inch buying generation will find irresistible. Secondly, it must be no longer than 3 minutes and 30 seconds. Just under 3:20 is preferable. If they are any longer, Radio 1 daytime DJs will start fading early and talking over the end, when the chorus is finally being hammered home, the most important part of any record. Thirdly, it must consist of an intro, a verse, a chorus, second verse, a second chorus, a breakdown section, back into a double-length chorus, and outro. Fourthly, lyrics. You will need some, but not many. The manual showed readers that if two guys with limited musical aspirations could get a number 1, you could too. I suppose the main thing about the book was saying, if you wanted to do something, go and do it. And it did actually break down the myth of going into the studio and doing something, if you're not very good at playing. About a year after Doctor in the TARDIS, Austrian dance collective Edelweiss managed a Europe-wide smash with Bring Me Edelweiss. Its hook a cunning interpolation of ABBA's SOS.
So when you're near me, darling, can't you hear me? SOS. So when you really love me, you should bring me Edelweiss.
They had taken their composition technique from the manual, specifically the line, compose your music with bits you've nicked from other songs. Drummond has stated that Primal Scream's Loaded and Hear the Drummer Get Wicked by Chad Jackson
Hear the drummer get wicked.
also used their methodology. They spent most of the rest of 1988 playing all the cheesy pop programs of Europe in aid of Doctor in the TARDIS, on occasion with soon-to-be disgraced glam idol Gary Glitter. When Drummond and Corty got back to England, they spent $8,000 on some new gear and built their own version of stock Aiken Waterman's Hit Factory in an abandoned house Corty was squatting in. It would be known as Trans Central, and from then on their studio releases would have recorded live at Trans Central on the sleeve. Immediately after they had their own studio, they got to work on their next project. On the first day we set it up, we wrote What Time Is Love. We were going to do a single a week for 5 weeks, pressing 2,000 of each. Then, after What Time Is Love, we spent 3 months trying to write the next one. A collection of minimalist acid house anthems. This series of 12-inch singles was to be called Pure Trance, and released under the name, the KLF. They mocked up the sleeves for the 5 planned 12 inches, but ultimately only released 3. What Time Is Love in October 1988. 3 AM Eternal in May 1989. and Last Train to Trans Central remix in March 1990. And then, to keep the air of mystery alive, they deleted the singles after 8 weeks. KLF means nothing. The sleeves have no reference points. Everything was really minimal. The music was really minimal. There was nothing for journalists to get into. It could only work on the dance floor. Alongside this, Drummond and Corti decided to take a large chunk of the money they had made from Doctoring the TARDIS to make a road movie. The intent was to go to Spain with a camera crew and drive around with 4 Time Lords, and have it be a 40-minute music video. It was called The White Room, and like most of their collaborative career, it had no plot. Returning to England, they realised after watching The Rushes, they had spent nearly £250,000 to make a film that was unwatchably dull. They released the Pet Shop Boys inspired Kylie Said to Jason from the film's soundtrack in July of 1989.
There was not much to find. Then Kylie said to Jason, it's all in the mind.
It was hoped that the single would be successful enough to save the group from looming bankruptcy. But it only charted at number 103. As a result, the whole White Room project was abandoned. But while this was all happening, Italian club DJs had gotten hold of What Time Is Love, and the time for love was now.
And then it started happening in Europe in the clubs. And then it started getting played in London quite a lot. And then it became a huge sort of club thing, without us really realising.
We'd never even been inside a club.
Monopolising on this newfound cult status, Drummond and Corti would start making public appearances at raves and clubs across the country. Despite their money woes, they showered the crowd at the Helter Skelter rave in 1989 with their fee for the night in Scottish pound notes, while other performances simply gave away the club's equipment to those in attendance. But whether the band indulged in shenanigans or not, these appearances rarely went as planned. It was always a nightmare. I'd always start off with the best intentions, have everything set up with samplers and sequencers ready to go, and attempt to play, or at least mix live, but we were either too out of it on drugs to be able to see anything, or the equipment always broke down, so usually what I'd do is then, I'd just turn the DAT tape on, which would sound much better anyway. It was a total shambles. Half the time there was no stage. In downtime from the KLF, Corti had been playing DJ sets with former Killing Joke roadie Alex Patterson in a small room in Paul Oakenfold's Land of Oz club in London. Inspired by 70s electronic artists like Brian Eno and Tangerine Dream, and implementing evocative BBC sound effects, the idea was to create a tranquil musical atmosphere for those coming down from a night of partaking E. Eventually the duo named themselves The Orb, although Corti would leave after only 2 singles. The Orb had created low-key dance music without the thumping drums, what would become known as ambient house. But as the KLF, Corti and Drummond would claim this trend for themselves, calcifying it as a proper genre by putting out the first full ambient house album, Chill Out, in February 1990. It took 3 days to make, but it was made of stuff we'd collected over a long period of time. It was jammed live here. We spent days practicing it, trying to get the samples and records lined up in the right order. It was like balancing spinning plates, utilising rail and road noise, animal sound, radio chatter,
17-year-old Jack Axadakos was driving home to Belmore last night.
and steel pedal guitar. The album is another KLF road trip, this time a nighttime drive through the Deep South, an autobahn for the 90s. The samples in this context, ranging from Elvis Presley's In the Ghetto to Fleetwood Mac's Albatross, feel like the AM radio being half listened to as the scenery whooshes by.
On a cold and grey Chicago morning,
The song titles reflect the stops on their fictional joyride. I've never been to those places. I don't know what those places are like, but in my head I can imagine those sounds coming from those places, just looking at the map. Chill Out didn't chart, but the music press heralded them as innovators in this new genre. However, Corty's old DJ partner, Alex Patterson, felt cheated. KLF put the Chill Out album out, which was basically a bunch of my DJ sessions at Trans Central, which I never got credited for. That was one of the major reasons why Jimmy and I split up. It was becoming apparent to me that everything he said he'd given me, he never gave me. But as Jimmy said to me, you're never really famous until you've been ripped off.
This is Radio Freedom.
Though the rave scene had started as an underground movement, it soon became more commercialized, and more club hits were having a significant impact on the UK charts. Europe-wide smashes like the Italo House of Black Box's Ride on Time, or the new beat of Technotronics, Pump Up the Jam, served just as much as club tracks as something that could be played on BBC Radio 1. Dance had become pop, and with that a lot of substandard club music became chart hits. I thought it's come down to this. We're in competition with Guru Josh, and I remember saying to Bill, well come on, let's have a hit single then, because we know how to do it. We haven't really been trying that hard. And so it was. For their 18-month assault on the European charts, the KLF would remix previous singles and ideas into dance pop monsters, what they fittingly described as Stadium House. The first was a maximalist reworking of What Time Is Love, annotated live at Trans Central.
What time is love? What time is love? What time is love?
Now with rap verses from MC Bello.
KLF is the crew you hear, yeah. Design a bomb I just won't fear. Back to react, enough is enough.
And repeated lifts from Wonder D's To The Bone.
I wanna see you sweat. Sweat. I wanna see you sweat. I wanna see you sweat. I wanna see you sweat.
But pared down from 7 minutes to a more radio-friendly length. Released at the end of July 1990, it peaked at number 5 6 weeks later. In January 1991, the similarly popified Live at the SSL version of 3 AM Eternal was next.
KLF is gonna rock you.
For this track, they had synths as guitars. The first cut is the deepest singer, P.P. Arnold, on the refrain. An oboe break. And had roped in Ricardo De Force to deliver the braggadocious rhymes.
Baseballistics, I'm gonna kick this hard. And you can catch it down with the crew talking about the moon.
Despite being 40 seconds longer than the manual suggested was ideal, this version of 3 AM Eternal hit number 1 in the UK charts, as well as in Denmark, Finland, and on the US Hot Dance chart. Last Train to Trans Central, live from the Lost Continent, came in March 91. The last pure trance single, from which the hooks had been integrated on Chill Out. UK number 2 for 2 weeks, held off by Cher's The Shoop Shoop song. Number 1 in Greece, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The White Room album, finally completed, also went top 5 on the UK album chart. But the stress took its toll, extremely burnt out by the strain of running their own label, creating new music, and constantly needing to deliver zingy sound bites to the press. They decided they needed to cut down on the whole being interviewed aspect. They put up a wall of silence, from which further intrigue bloomed. Who were this band? And what were they doing? On the summer solstice of 1991, the KLF flew the world's music press to the Isle of Inlay in the Inner Hebrides off the west coast of Scotland, before being ferried to the airportless Isle of Jura. There, Drummond and Corty, dressed in military uniforms, acted as border patrol and stamped everyone's passports with the KLF logo. Then, dressing their 30 or so guests in ceremonial robes, Drummond led a pagan ritual of their own invention, orating to the assembled throng in a made-up language, while an unseen Corty operated a sound system loud enough to bother the surrounding islands. The event ended with the burning of a wicker man and a rave. As usual, no explanations were given. The fourth single of their unbeatable chart assault would end up being their most enduring. The hook of Justified and Ancient had been knocking about since the beginning, appearing on Hey Hey We're Not the Monkeys, the first track on the Jam's now destroyed debut LP. Since then, it had haunted their work, showing up on Chill Out, before becoming a fully actualized version on The White Room, sung by Black Steel.
They're justified and they're ancient.
But all these variants were missing something. Working on the single mix of the track, they worked out exactly what that something was.
There was somebody who was going to be singing, or had sung already, and it just wasn't working out. And Jimmy kind of half-jokingly said to me, what this track needs is Tammy Wynette.
It's hard to be a woman.
Tammy Wynette was an American country singer who had made her name with heartbreak ballads in the 70s. Her big hit in the UK being Stand By Your Man in 1975. Straight away, Drummond unironically recognised that Wynette's voice was indeed the absent element, despite existing within the worlds of punk and dance. Drummond was a big country music fan. The copious use of steel pedal guitar on Chill Out had been at his insistence. Now with some clout behind their name, having had a US Billboard Top 5 with 3am Eternal, they gave Wynette a call. After Drummond played the work-in-progress version of the song down the phone, she immediately agreed to lend her voice to the track. I don't know why they chose me. I was apprehensive at first, but I'm really excited with the way it's all turned out. Moo Moo Land looks a lot more interesting than Tennessee. But I wouldn't want to live there. Having a guest vocalist on a house track has slowly become common practice, as producers didn't want to have to give away a portion of their publishing and potential revenue for clearing a vocal sample. But normally these were classic soul and disco singers like Martha Wash, formerly of the Weather Girls. But was adding a country singer a genre fusion too far? Unlike the onslaught of hooks that the Stadium House singles were built from, Justified and Ancient, Stand By the Jams, follows a more standard pop template. Ricardo DeForce's interjections and the choral elements, all serving Wynette's vocal. In addition to subtle steel pedal guitar to better mix Wynette's country with the KLF's house.
They're justified and they're ancient. We're still no master.
The main riff is another sample, a mostly disguised swipe of Jimi Hendrix's Voodoo Child, Slight Return. For the video, the KLF went to Pinewood Studios, renting the same stage used for James Bond films. When Corty arrived at the shoot, however, he was confronted by quite the surprise.
And it wasn't until he actually met Tammy, but maybe 3 months after we recorded, and Jimmy took me aside and says, I think there's a mistake here, Bill. You know, this isn't the woman I was expecting. I says, what? And he started describing, and it was obviously Dolly Parton. He got Dolly Parton and Tammy Wynette muddled up.
Justified and Ancient Stand By the Jams would chart at number 11 on the US Billboard Hot 100, and peaked at number 2 in the UK charts. There was unfortunately no chance of it reaching number 1. That slot was occupied by Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, re-released after the death of Freddie Mercury. By the beginning of 1992, the KLF should have been on top of the world. In the 18 months since the release of What Time Is Love, live at Trans Central, they had sold 2.5 million singles. In 1991, they were the biggest selling singles act in Europe, and yet they hated how readily the mainstream had embraced them. They were provocateurs, agents of chaos, not pop idols. But being one of the biggest selling acts of the previous year, the KLF were invited to open the 1992 Brit Awards with a performance of their number 1 single, 3am Eternal. Sick and tired of the pop game, they aimed to deliver a performance so distasteful that they'd never be asked back by anyone. They would team with Ipswich crust-punk band Extreme Noise Terror to create a further reimagining of 3am Eternal. A performance that would supposedly include Drummond chopping off his own actual hand on stage and throwing it into the music industry packed crowd. Cooler heads prevailed, and this was revised to throwing several gallons of pig's blood and a dismembered sheep into the crowd. Neither of these were preferable to the members of Extreme Noise Terror. There was some tension. We're an extreme vegetarian band, known for smashing up butchers' shops. We couldn't justify that. Come showtime, the lights came up to show Drummond in a kilt, balancing on a crutch, flanked by the members of Extreme Noise Terror. As the producers deemed their guitar sound to be offensive, the live mix was mostly a deafening cocktail of thundering bass, D-beat drums, and Dean Jones' guttural bellows, barely discernible as 3am Eternal. The performance ended with Drummond machine gunning the crowd with blanks, and an explosion of pyro behind them. Then an announcement over the PA. As a final insult to the KLF, they would win Best British Band, tied with the adult contemporary pap of Simply Red.
I give it all up for you. I give it all up for you. I give it all up for you.
But by this point, Drummond and Corti were long gone, getting a bicycle messenger to collect their award, while they disposed of the dead sheep on the steps of the Brit Awards after party, with the note, "I died for you." They would bury their Brit at Stonehenge. It was found by a local farmer the following year, who returned it to them. They responded by going back to bury it even deeper. And that was the end of the KLF. To further confirm their demise, they would delete their discography, so no one, in the UK at least, could buy any more of their records. Because why look back? The KLF are dead. Drummond and Corti instead became the K Foundation, not so much a musical act as a project of art terrorism. Their most famous project was returning to the Isle of Jura in August 1994, with a suitcase filled with £1 million worth of £50 notes, and burning it all in an abandoned boathouse. They filmed the whole thing, and they still don't know why they did it, a decision that still haunts them. A lot of people probably thought that maybe we did have a proper vision, but we didn't really. We were just making it up from day to day. However, being the band that burnt 1 million probably wouldn't be the KLF's legacy if their music had still existed. They were sampling anarchists, accidental acid house masters, pioneers of ambient house, and the best-selling singles act of 1991. They were the band who taught you how to have a number one the easy way. It's a lot to give away to maintain their eternal mystique. And so after almost 3 decades of being unable to get access to their music legally, In early 2021, the KLF re-released their 2 albums and a lot of the classic singles onto streaming platforms. And if you haven't heard any of this music before, you're in for a treat. The KLF are gonna rock ya. Are you ready? Thanks for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe. Why don't you also do me a favour and share it with a couple of people? It really does help. Be sure to head over to the second channel for some extra KLF trivia that got cut for time. As always, I'd like to shout out this month's new supporters over on Patreon. Neil Downing, Lee Spencer, Nigel Noodle Doodle, and Ken. Thank you, and thanks to all that support me. And I'll see you in 3 weeks' time for something black as your soul.